All right, we can go ahead and get started. Thanks everyone so much for coming. We do have a few more people that are joining in, but we'll just go ahead and get started here. So my name is Katie Grillo. I am the GIS Web Technology Specialist at the City of Cambridge, and I'm also your NEARC Board President. So thank you so much for coming to another NEARC community event. As I say at the beginning of all these events, just as a reminder, NEARC hosts 2 annual conferences every year. We have a one-day spring event, which is coming up next month on Tuesday, May 18th. And then we also have a 3-day conference in the fall, which this year is scheduled for October 17th through the 20th. And that will be hosted in person at the Omni New Haven Hotel at Yale in New Haven, Connecticut. So these NEARC community events are designed to bring us together between those 2 major conferences. And we have and will continue to host our informal Mappy Hours, which there's one coming up next month that I'll talk about at the end of today's event. But we are also hosting more of these workshops. And these workshops are really designed to be interactive and will include a short presentation and then discussion and/or hands-on activity. So for today's workshop, we are joined by Justin Madrone, and Justin is the Digital Scholarship Lab's GIS project manager and analyst. He leads processes efforts involving the production and organization of spatial data that is used by the Digital Scholarship Lab's work. He focuses in and on data management and historical interactive mapping techniques. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Landscape Architecture from West Virginia University and a Master's from Virginia Commonwealth University in Environmental Studies with a focus on GIS and technologies. Justin is an adjunct lecturer for the Department of Geography and teaches courses in GIS, design, and geovisualization. He's also the director and instructor of the School of Professional Studies GIS Certificate Program at the University of Richmond. So today, Justin is going to be leading us through a hands-on workshop to explore how maps play a role in understanding the ways in which federal practices have and can continue to cause more inequities in our urban communities. I'll let Justin explain more as our expert, but before I hand it over to him, just one more thing I want to mention is that for this workshop, we are going to be using ArcGIS Online maps and data from the Living Atlas. So to participate in the hands-on portion, it's recommended that you have access to an ArcGIS Online account. If you don't have access, you can just feel free to sit back and watch. This event is being recorded, so you can always come back to it later on. All right, with that, I'll hand it over to Justin.
Great. Well, thank you, Katie. Thanks to Katie and Adam for having me for this event. I'm always really excited to meet new folks and talk a little bit about the work we're doing, as well as hopefully shed some light on some new mapping tools and maybe a new perspective that you haven't encountered before. So like Katie said, I'd love for this to be more interactive than me talking for an hour and 15 minutes. So at any point, if you have questions or want to dive deeper into something, please let me know. And more organic conversation is more interesting for everyone, I think, than me just blabbing along, which I can easily do. So please stop me at any point if you want to talk more or go maybe a different direction. So let me share my screen. We'll jump right in.
And to that point, the chat is enabled, so you can feel free to pose questions in the chat or raise your hand, or if you're feeling really bold, just go ahead and unmute and ask away. Thanks.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, Katie, if there's any questions that show up in the chat, maybe if you want to.
Yeah, I'll keep an eye on it.
For you. Yeah, perfect.
Yeah.
All right. Let me see here. All right, we're good to go. Actually, let me stop 1 second. All right. Everybody see my screen?
Yep, looks good.
Perfect. All right. Like I said, my name is Justin Madrone. I work at the Digital Scholarship Lab. We're a small scholars lab located in our library. We do digital humanities projects more broadly, but we really focus on making interactive and high impact maps of American history. We do a lot of different projects. If you want to check those out, our website's dsl.richmond.edu. You can look at all of the different projects that we work on. We cover all sorts of topics in American history, although more recently we've focused more on kind of social justice type issues and have really put a lot of effort and rallied around our project that I'm going to talk to you today about, which is mapping inequality, which looks at redlining in the 1930s and 1940s. But we do some congressional mapping, urban renewal. We released Photogrammer recently, which hosts about 100 pictures from the Library of Congress. Look at some international presidential travel, as well as kind of some census type data like foreign born, overland trails, and things like that. This is part of a larger project called American Panorama. We were received a grant from the Mellon Foundation about 6-7 years ago now to create a digital atlas of American history. And think back to, as you were a kid, those atlases you flipped open and there's all sorts of stuff talking about, maybe agriculture in America or census information, kind of a holistic view of what the United States looked like at that time. So we decided to do something like that, but at a digital version. So hence American Panorama. In each chapter or map in that atlas really kind of condenses, I would say, a whole chapter, right, of American history into a web application. So there's all sorts of stuff in there, but we're going to talk a little bit about mapping inequality today. So this is the actual mapping inequality site, and we're going to walk through about what redlining is and the archival documents that are contained in this project, and a little bit about how we created the project, and then we're going to get our hands on some actual redlining data and build a web app using Esri's ArcGIS Online. So that's kind of what we have planned for today. This is a basic overview of all of the cities that were redlined. So has everybody heard of the term redlining for the most part? Would anybody like to give us a brief overview of what redlining is? I'll put people on the spot. Anyone? Don't be shy.
I did mention that Justin is a teacher, so he will call on some of you if necessary.
Well, that's okay. All right. So basically what redlining refers to is, and let's take a little example of one of the maps, right? This is, most people hear the term redlining and they see these maps, and this is a map of Boston. And it really comes from the term in these maps that had these very harsh and very kind of sharp boundaries that separated neighborhoods, right? And so if one neighborhood was deemed hazardous versus the other, right, that neighborhood was redlined, right? And this all stems from these maps. And a lot of people have seen these maps or seen a few of these maps or heard the term redlining, but there's a lot more kind of backstory and information and data really behind the creation of these maps, which we're going to dive into a little bit. So to step back just a little bit and kind of set the stage, let's go back to 1933 when FDR was just taking office. There was a huge financial crisis, and it led to closures of hundreds of banks and then a federal bank holiday. About a quarter of the workforce was unemployed, and about a third of mortgaged homes were in default, right? So pretty bad. The Homeowners Loan Corporation was enacted and started, and they were appropriated about $3 billion to rescue the housing and financial sectors. They refinanced about 1 million homes, and they created that long-term amortized mortgage schedule that we're all, I'm sure, familiar with. But what a lot of people don't know is they conducted city surveys to create this almost clearinghouse of local markets, right? This really detailed, intimate look at neighborhoods across a lot of our major cities. And so we decided we wanted to surface these documents. So with collaboration with our colleagues at Virginia Tech, NYU, and UNC, we went to the National Archive, we scanned all these documents, we started georeferencing, we started digitizing, and we started transcribing all this information. And we thought about what a project would look like to, one, explain what redlining was, and two, get this information out for people to do research, for historians, for economists, and we'll talk about kind of the uses of this. So this project really updates a study of what New Deal America was. It offers really unprecedented access to this collection of security maps and area descriptions. So how were these maps used, right? So, okay, they created these maps, but what was the purpose of these maps? Well, to make these maps, they recruited local mortgage lenders, developers, and real estate appraisers in nearly 250 cities across the US. They went out into the communities and they filled out these forms, which we're going to take a look at. And those resulted in these color-coded credit worthiness or risk of neighborhood maps that you'll see. And this is Baltimore on the right. And this contributed to both American prosperity on one hand and racial inequalities on the other, right? And again, this is where the term redlining came. So each of the neighborhoods you see in the maps have an accompanying form or document, which they call area descriptions. And these are really a deep dive and a look into what that neighborhood looks like, and then and then a justification and clarification of why it was deemed either A, B, C, or D. So this is what one of the forms looked like, and we're going to kind of walk through a case study of Tacoma, Washington, for demonstration purposes, and what these area descriptions look like. And this will kind of give us a general view of a lot of what America looked like, right, according to these homeowners loan corporation maps. And then we'll jump around and actually dive into the application and take a look. But they contain a lot of information, and this is just for one neighborhood, right? This isn't for Tacoma. This is for the Proctor district in Tacoma, Washington. There's things listed on here like area characteristics, and those involve things like terrain, favorable influences, detrimental influences, right? And here, the Proctor district, the favorable influences were transportation, schools, churches, trading centers. Detrimental influences were lack of deed and zoning protection from apartment houses. And some streets are graveled and not paved, right? So there's some very detailed information on what the neighborhood looks like, what they deem favorable and what they deem detrimental. Now, keep in mind, these area descriptions are made by local realtors, local developers, local appraisers, right? So this isn't, somebody from the Fed coming in from DC and, walking around Tacoma, Washington and filling out these forms. These are people who know the area, right, and that are kind of filling these out and the kind of the best way they see fit, with instructions from the homeowners loan corporation about kind of criteria. And there's all sorts of other things, right? Like who the inhabitants, which we're going to dive into a little bit more, and why these are so controversial and problematic and long lasting. But as well as other things like, the buildings, the type of buildings that were there, the average age, the construction year, the price of rent, the activity, the rental demand in these areas, availability of mortgage funds, all sorts of other information about the neighborhood, right? So we get this really detailed look at our cities in the 1930s and 1940s from these documents. So, what were these used for, right? Why did these forms exist, right? So generally, right, they were used to rate neighborhoods on risk and credit worthiness, right? But mortgage lenders actually use these to determine if they would give out mortgages in these areas or refinancing, right? So A areas were considered like hot spots, right? These were good mortgage lending places. They would give kind of maximum loan, right? 75 to 80% of appraisal. B areas were described as still good, but not as hot as A areas. And these were, usually about 65% of appraisals. As you get into C neighborhoods, they were cautioned to be more conservative in these areas. And if a neighborhood was termed D for hazardous or red, right, redlined, they were basically told to refuse these loans or only make them on a very, very conservative basis, right? So these grades have enormous impacts, right? So if you lived in an A neighborhood versus a D neighborhood, you can obviously see the implications of not being able to refinance your home or money coming in, right? Denial of capital to these neighborhoods by people getting mortgages and be able to refinance and get repairs on their homes, right? Huge impacts. So we talk a lot about the geographical space of these neighborhoods, but more importantly, they were looking at not only what was there, the types of buildings, the terrain. More importantly, what drove these was who was living there more so than anything else. And we see that two things they were looking for were: is there any immigrants in this community? Or is there any African Americans living in this community? And these were the two kind of factors that really drove the grading and the kind of designation of those neighborhoods. So they were told to kind of pay attention to a couple of groups in particular, right? And most notably, those being African Americans. They even included a piece on the form, and there's 4 forms total. They all kind of follow the same schema, different orders. They kind of advanced as they went through a couple years, but they all basically collect the same thing. And they were looking for any threat of infiltration of foreign-born Negro or lower grade population is how they deemed this, right? And so we'll look at why this says infiltration remote in a second. But that was a key driver in designating if a neighborhood got a certain grade, right? Were these kind of 3 or 4 pieces of the form that looked for that. And so you can see here, right, it says D, Negro, yes, family. So this is a B neighborhood. This is B2, which is a Proctor district in Tacoma, Washington. It was inhabited by predominantly American-born whites who were professional and clerical and artisans, and it was assigned to B, which is pretty standard. And this is what the Proctor district looked like in Tacoma. We see that it's this blue neighborhood. And diving kind of a little bit into the aesthetics and the cartographic piece of this, the maps are very aesthetically pleasing, right? I think they're very well done. They look very nice, but they have there's a madness to the method as far as the coloring scheme to this, right? A kind of means go, C means caution, and D means stop, right? So these were very much intended for lenders to look at this and have this very clear coloring code system that designated whether they lend to these areas. So we looked at, remember it said infiltration remote, right? And we look at the Proctor district neighborhood here, B2, and we see that it wraps around this neighborhood, this D neighborhood, like a couple blocks, right? A little small area. And let's take a look at the area description for that. So as we dive into the area description, we see that it says, except as noted in clarifying remarks below, this area is identical in all aspects to area B2, right? So they're saying housing stock, rent prices, structures, favorable influences, all that are exactly the same, right, as B2. The only difference is if you go down to the clarifying remarks, 3 highly respected Negro families own homes and live in the middle block of this area facing Verde Street. While very much above the average of their race, it is quite generally recognized by realtors that their presence seriously detracts from the desirability of the eminent neighborhood, right? So based on race alone, right, and that they are in proximity to this neighborhood, one, it's cut out from that and then given a D rating. But, you know, it's basically detached from that and then given a hazardous rating. And you'll see this across the US a lot. Sometimes they will include that area in that neighborhood, but then the neighborhood might receive a C grade. So it really depends on the surveyors and how they're chunking this up. A lot of times they will cut out where African American families live, right, in a certain neighborhood, cut that out, give that a D neighborhood, and then actually that's seen as a detrimental influence to the white neighborhood that touches that. And we see this across the US a lot. So we transcribed nearly 7,500 of these area descriptions, and it really provides some really interesting perspectives and looks into what was kind of driving and what they were looking for within these area descriptions and what they were looking for in each neighborhood. And so what we did is we looked at these and did some kind of basics textual analysis. So this is for Tacoma, right? And we're looking at just professions now, right? And so we're surfacing the most common words for profession. And here you'll see in B area, we have minor executives, professional salaried upper class, tradespeople salary class. And then in C, what we see working people, better people moving out, working people, laborers. And then what's really interesting is that when we get over to the A neighborhood, aside from representative businessmen, we see really no mention of occupation. All we see is best people or best, right? But it's basically, you know, saying it doesn't really matter what the profession is of the people living in the neighborhood, right? It's kind of moot. They're the best people, right? Their grandparents were the best people. Their grandchildren will be the best people, right? And this is kind of, you know, wealth and privilege is transferred from generation to generation, right? And we'll see how they kind of perpetuate that, right, and make sure that that stays the same. But they don't even really, you know, put a lot of description into these A neighborhoods. Sometimes they'll leave most of the form blank. They'll put, you know, best people as the occupation, and they leave out a lot of information about the types of buildings, and it's really kind of a blank form because it, you know, for them it's pointless, right? This is an A neighborhood. It's all you need to know, right? Now, on the flip side of that, if we go over to the D neighborhoods, we don't see a lot of mention of labor class or occupation in here either, right? All we see is the term Negro or percent Negro, right? And this is kind of the polar opposite of what we're talking about in A neighborhoods, right? That, you know, African American lives here. That's all you need to know for this, right? This is a D neighborhood. And this is for Tacoma, Washington, but we see this play out over and over again in cities across the US. So we did this for the whole entire US as well, right? We took all the area descriptions for the entire country, and, you know, we looked at these. But this data really has been used from across multiple different organizations. The Federal Reserve recently released a report that looked at spatial analysis and how they concluded that these maps really exacerbated and entrenched inequalities of wealth, and the maps led to reduced credit access and higher borrowing costs, which really contributed to disinvestment in poor urban and neighborhoods, and had long run repercussions. Other studies have been done that looks at this in connections to differences in asthma and health inequalities, and environmental inequalities, growing disparities in home equity. So Zillow did a research using this that looked at home equity prices over the long term and how A, B, C, and D neighborhoods fared through time. And so we're going to dive into this a little bit more and take a look at some more area descriptions here. And this is for the entire US now that we're looking at. This was a kind of a frequency text analysis. So we got rid of all the kind of filler words. And this looks for very high frequency words that are seen over and over again. This wasn't really shocking to us what this surfaced. I mean, it kind of just solidified what we already knew. There were some interesting things that popped out we'll take a look at, but for the most part, right, it actually fits really nicely into what we predicted and what we thought, as far as like class and occupation and wealth, and race. So as we kind of go through this, we see these very clear distinctions of class, right? Upper class in A, kind of upper middle in B, lower middle in C, and then low class, low income in D. The language is kind of very similar to what we saw in Tacoma, right? B, we see executives, business professionals. C, we see clerks, working laborers, and then in D, we see some mention of occupation in here, right? But we see unskilled labor, WPA workers, things like that. So again, right, we see the mention of race, right? And we see most of this in D neighborhoods, right? We see white in B, we see mixed white in C, and then we see mentions of race and ethnicity, right, in D. And what's really interesting is we see surface is homogeneous population, right? And so that's probably seen as a favorable influence in these B neighborhoods, right? And talking about mixed race and the mixing of races, and and this is the 1930s and 1940s, right? And so these are playing into effects of how people are, or whether people are giving certain mortgage or lending rates, or getting lending at all, right, based on that alone. And so talking about kind of homogeneous populations, is we see the mention of kind of leftovers from the 1920s and 30s were restricted covenants, right? And these were restricted covenants were written into property deeds at homes that prohibited owners from selling or leasing the property of members to releasing the property to members of a particular race or religions, typically African Americans, but also sometimes other groups like Jews or East Asian descent. And we see this mentioned in A's, right? Highly restricted. So these are very highly restricted neighborhoods. And then B's, we see, mildly restricted. When we talk about redlining, and when historians and economists talk about redlining, they often talk about, the denial of capital, right? Or disinvestment from these neighborhoods, right? But what actually this showed was we see a fair amount of mention of rental collection, right? Difficulty with rentals, rental collections, tenements. And C, we see good rentals and rents quoted. So it's not really surprising, right? Poor people more likely rent than own their homes, and they were more likely to live in C and D neighborhoods. But you know, kind of pulling some verbiage from one of our colleagues, Nathan Conley, who's an historian at NYU, um, he said it's really hard to overstate that the profitability of slum housing in Jim Crow area. And we really miss a key aspect of redlining when we only emphasize that it impeded poor working class and Black Americans from becoming homeowners. It also made sure that they remained renters whose earnings were captured by those who typically did not live in their neighborhoods, but who owned the tenements, apartments, and homes that they were rented, right? So not only were they renting, but they could not own homes in the neighborhoods and communities of which they lived, right? And so if they lived in a D, C, or D neighborhoods, the chances of them getting lending in those neighborhoods in which they lived were very slim, right? So they were most time forced or had no other option but to rent in those neighborhoods, right? And so we see this coming out in the D neighborhoods, right? It's talked about a lot. So this is a look at the area descriptions, right? And kind of jumping back to the application and how you can look at these, right? You can click on any neighborhood and you'll get, obviously you can see that neighborhood where it's at, but you can see the transcribed version over here, or you can jump in and look at the original scan, right? You can read all the things in all of the different forms. We can see that this form is very similar to the one we were looking at earlier. More interesting is probably the clarifying remarks. This is where they really jump in and look at and explain why certain neighborhoods were rated the way they were. If you jump back out to the map, you can go, we've curated some of the area descriptions. So this was a new addition in our version 2 part of mapping inequality, was that we looked for, just some area descriptions that, were interesting and that showed really the effects that these had, right? And really the purpose and the what Homeowners Loan Corporation was actually looking for, right, when they went to these neighborhoods. And so you can scroll through here and take a look at, different area descriptions. You can search these, right? So if you're interested in things like schools, right, you can see all the areas that mention schools, right? Again, here's a neighborhood that has, it's rated D, and favorable influences are good schools and transportation, right? So we can click on that. We can jump in and maybe see why it's rated D. Yeah, so probably, 50% of the neighborhood is probably immigrant Syrian population, some African American families in there, and then if we jump in here, it probably tells us a little bit more about why that is. There's a couple map views that you can look at. So kind of big picture holistically, right, we're looking at Boston. You can see that most of the Boston area is made up of C neighborhoods, 64%, 25% D, and then 3% A. And we get some demographics here. So this is a population in 1940. And kind of interacting with the map is you can obviously click on any neighborhood you would like. There's a couple different map views that you can do. You can reorder these, right? Because we have a lot of maps on top of each other. This comes into play a lot when we're looking at places like New York City, which has a ton of maps. This was kind of from a cartographic and user interface perspective. This was really, we had a lot of challenge with figuring out how to kind of make this work. So this was one solution. Another solution we came up with was, well, let's just cut out basically all of the other stuff around, right? So basically get rid of all of the noise. So the white parts, maybe the more base map parts, cut out the area descriptions, right? The graded areas, and then you can see this, overlaid more nicely with a base map. You can also just look at polygons too if you really want to see underneath and get an idea of kind of orienting yourself to today's landscape and topography or street grid. But this is probably one of my favorite views is this one, because I think it's just a nice aesthetic, and you can look at the graded ones really easily. There's a really good introduction here if you want to learn a little bit more about redlining, and then all the data is freely available, right? So you can download it as a shapefile, as a GeoJSON. You can jump in and you can grab a city. You can grab all the area description images, the shapefile for that city, the rectified image, and all of that stuff. So we give all the data away. We're going to actually work with the data that is now in the Living Atlas. So we worked with Esri on getting this data up to the Living Atlas, and we're going to use some of that data to make a map. But I want to talk a little bit more about the work that's being done before we jump into the hands-on portion, and maybe take a couple questions before we jump into that, on, how does this work? What's being done with this data now, right? So we talked a little bit about Zillow, the Fed's done some work with this. There's been a lot of historians doing some work with this. More recently, some environmental historians have been doing work with this, looking at effects of redlining and how those neighborhoods maybe fare with climate change. But we worked with the NCRC, which did this really nice statistical white paper and looking at significance of health risk and social vulnerability, right? And so we're going to kind of play off this project today, and we're going to build a map that looks at redlining and social vulnerability from the CDC's perspective. But we built this kind of to accompany their white paper. And I'm going to grab, we'll just do Boston because there's just so much data for that. I know folks probably not from Boston are tired of seeing Boston examples, but we'll grab Boston because I think it's pretty interesting. So this is the not even past. So this is looking at redlining and current day census tracts using the CDC's social vulnerability. And we'll dive a little bit more into what that means. But basically, they use 4 themes, and they map the social vulnerability of a community based on those 4 themes and give it a score of 0 to 1. So 0 means they're not very vulnerable. 1 means it's a very vulnerable community, right? And so we created this Sankey diagram here that tries to kind of draw the lines, right, from the past to the present, right? So you can look at, yeah. Good. All right, so you can draw a line from a past, or a red line neighborhood and see where it is today. So this neighborhood D9, you can see actually is rated by the CDC as pretty high vulnerability, right, based on those themes. But other neighborhoods that were rated D or redlined for this example, right, this small area, kind of think more towards the downtown, is actually one of the less vulnerable communities now, right? And so there's all sorts of factors that play into this. Obviously, there's no clear direct connection. The paper dives a little bit more into the statistics and drawing those connections and how significant those connections are. This visualization is just kind of fun to play with and look at, and it can probably tell us a little bit more. I'm not familiar with downtown Boston or where this exactly is. I'd imagine this is probably a highly gentrified area now, right? And so that's probably why we're seeing this. And we see this play out in places where I live, like Richmond, Virginia. And yeah, it's just really interesting to kind of look at this and see where these go. Some A, B neighborhoods have become maybe a little more vulnerable over time. And we can kind of see how that plays out. This B neighborhood is actually a very high vulnerable community right now. So this is a really kind of fun project. You can look at all sorts of different, different cities across the U.S. Again, here's all the neighborhoods in Massachusetts. But you can dive in and look at these kind of more, and because it's census data, some of these smaller maps and smaller cities, it doesn't really quite work as well, right? But you can click on, back to Boston, you can click on these neighborhoods, right? And you can see the area description, and then you can dive in and look at the social vulnerability. And this tells you how it rates compared to other neighborhoods, right? So it's towards the higher end. We can see demographics. It's the minority percentage is pretty high in this neighborhood. Life expectancy is pretty low compared to other neighborhoods. Median age, and then we jump into disease and health conditions. So asthma. So asthma rates are higher. Cancer rates are actually kind of lower. Diabetes higher. High blood pressure. All of these things tend to be a little bit higher than their counterparts, right? And so you can see how that neighborhood kind of fares today as far as social vulnerability, as well as other health outcomes. All right, so I'm going to stop right there. Is there any questions or comments or?
Yeah, and folks can feel free to unmute if they want to ask live. Neil posted two different well, one question, one comment. His first, Neil, are you there? Do you want to jump in?
Sure. Maybe you answered this earlier, Justin, but because it seems as though maybe these boundaries were developed from the surveys that were done, but it wasn't clear to me whether the surveys were done sort of street to street, house to house. And so I was curious about the basis of those boundaries. Did they come out of those surveys, or were there some boundaries, neighborhood boundaries that made sense at that time that they're kind of using as a cartographic basis irrespective of kind of the surveys? So I'm just curious to know what insight you guys, or what evidence you found when you were looking at how those boundaries were drawn.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So keep in mind, these were done by local people who are familiar with the area. They were designated by the people doing the surveys, right? So what I didn't mention in the talk, and I'll jump back over real quick and show you, is that a lot of these cities actually had draft maps before final maps. So what happened is they would create a draft map, they would send it up to the main Hulk office, and then the cartographer there would create these maps that have this consistency to them, right? So if we look at, say, Savannah, Georgia, we don't have a final map for that. What we see is this is the map that was given, right? And so it's very vague. And they kind of color penciled on this and said, this is this neighborhood, this is that neighborhood, right? So they really relied on those local real estate appraisers, real estate agents, developers, appraisers, right, for that local knowledge. And we are getting ready to go back to the National Archive to look at correspondence between the people on the ground and the Homeowners Loan Corporation to understand a little bit more about how the maps were actually created. We don't know a lot about that right now, but that's something we're going to be working on the next year. Great question.
And Justin, one question, just thinking about moving forward and doing more research, will you be updating using the 2020 census data?
Oh yeah. So, well, the 2020 census data is just mostly population and I think demographic. We're pulling a lot of the CDC stuff. I think a lot of that comes from some of the stuff we're pulling comes from the American Community Survey. But yeah, we've kind of debated on how much we try to draw connections to current places on the ground, because a lot of people are doing that really good work, right? We're trying to be an educator and a provider of this data for people who are more knowledgeable about that stuff, right? So like economists and demographers, people like that who know a little bit more about that stuff to say, okay, well, here's redlining data, right? It's in really good form. I know how to use that now, right? How can I statistically look at that and compare to today? So no plans for that right now, but I'm sure somebody will be doing that down the road.
Yeah, absolutely. We have another question from Karen. She said, what tool did you use for the textual analysis?
Good question. So our director is a very gifted, he's a historian. He has his PhD in American history. but he's also a very gifted programmer. So he actually did the text analysis himself. I think he used some type of frequency analysis. I'm not exactly sure of the exact methods he used. If you're interested, contact me after this and I could definitely get you some more specs on that. But he kind of did that by hand.
Great. And then we just got another question in from Emily. She said, where can I locate the quote unquote missing areas description? So I'm assuming, Emily, you're talking about areas that might not be designated in the maps.
Yeah, so there's a
Right.
few areas. Yeah, there's a few areas where we have the maps, but we don't have area descriptions, right? And I think I pulled up one of those examples actually in that Sankey diagram that yeah, very few, right? We have very few we have a few where we have area descriptions but no map, and then we have a few that we have a map and no area description. So with the pandemic, we haven't been able to get back into the National Archive. So our plan is we have a list of things we want to kind of go look for and see. We hope that they're there. We just missed them the first time because it was such an overwhelming amount of information that we scanned originally. So we want to go back and try to fill in some of those holes. So I would say, keep a lookout for version 3 for that.
Great, thank you. That's it for now, but folks, if you do have questions, feel free to keep posting to the chat. And yeah, Justin, let's
All right, let's dive in.
Get our hands into it.
Perfect.
Yeah.
All right, so the next phase is, well, what can I do with this data, right? So of course you can download it from our website. You can grab the GeoJSON shapefiles. It's a Creative Commons license, so we ask that you cite us, but feel free to use it and do research for whatever you'd like. I think the easiest way to dive into this is is through Esri's Living Atlas. Now, if you use open source software as well, then I recommend you maybe jump in and get it from our website, because you can grab it as GeoJSON. You can put it in QGIS, you can make leaflet maps, all that fun stuff. But if you're in the Esri ecosystem, like a lot of us are, they've made it really easy for you. So what we're going to do today is we're going to look at some redlining data in the new map viewer. So has anybody used the new map viewer before? It just came out of beta, I think, a week or two ago. So we're going to learn a little bit more about that. So it's really easy to find data on the Living Atlas. So if you just navigate to the Living Atlas, make sure to sign in if you're following along. And we're just going to type in redlining.
I just put the link in the chat, folks. Perfect. For the Living Atlas.
Yep, and if you just Google ArcGIS Living Atlas of the World, it should be your first hit there. So you'll see once we search for redlining, there's all sorts of stuff, right? And you can actually just, if you want to browse, you can look for trending data, imagery, boundaries, all sorts of categories they have here. There's all sorts of filtering you can do. There's a lot of products available. So this is the one by us, and this actually feeds the Living Atlas layer. So these are the same exact one. So don't get confused and think, oh, well, there's two different ones here. Which one do I choose? They're the same. I would choose the one from the Living Atlas itself, which is Diana, who runs and works on that. And there's also like redlining and exposure to urban heat island effects. So Dan Pichute at Esri and Jeremy Huffman at the Science Museum have done some scientific work on looking at redlining and heat island effects. So if you're into that, there's some really cool stuff there, as well as the dashboard down here. But we're going to jump into the polygons here, right? So this is all the digitized polygons that we have. There's a nice description here. Diana at the Living Atlas has done you the favor of actually they made a nice pop-up, which we'll look at already, and it's already styled, which is really cool. So it's really easy to make a web map out of this. So I'm going to click the little blue pull down because I don't want to use the classic anymore. I want to jump into the new map viewer. And this is going to basically just grab that layer and put it into a new web map for us, right? So it's that easy, right? We're now looking at redline data in a web map. So you can see that the pop-ups are already curated for us. It's a nice little pop-up that has some coloring to it. It talks a little bit about what this means. And so that's already ready to go for you, right? They've already curated the legend so that, it's all really nice and ready to use. But what we're going to do is we're going to create a web map looking at redlining and social vulnerability. So to add more layers to this, we're going to just go to add layer. Of course, you can add layers from your content if you would like. You can add it from Living Atlas, ArcGIS Online as a whole. If you've never really worked with pulling in stuff from ArcGIS Online or the Living Atlas is authoritative content, so it's vetted. So if you're grabbing census data from there, you can be assured that it's good, clean census data. ArcGIS Online is kind of everybody as a whole, anybody that's opened up their data with the world. Tom down the road maybe drank too much coffee that morning and hit a couple extra numbers on how many people lived in a certain census tract, right? That could be the issue with ArcGIS Online. Not to say that that's not reputable data, but it's not authoritative, right? So just be careful in what you're pulling from ArcGIS Online. But I'm going to go to the Living Atlas. It's the same kind of search as we did before, right? So I'm going to search CDC social, which is the CDC Social Vulnerability Index. And I'm going to grab this. This is from 2018. You can see this comes from data by the CDC. This little globe here means that it's from the Living Atlas. It's authoritative, so it's good stuff. So I'm going to add that in. Now, the Living Atlas and the CDC, again, this is why I love adding data from the Living Atlas. Instead of downloading these shapefiles, having to do joins with the census tracts, having to style all this stuff, it's already styled for you, right? If you zoom out, it gives you the counties as you zoom, right? So there's some reference scale stuff that's already set here for you. If you want to make a more kind of immersive web map out of this. I don't want the county stuff for this demonstration, so I'm just going to click on the ... and I'm going to remove that. You could just leave it in there and turn it off if you want, but I'm just going to remove it to kind of clean things up. So you see we're left with the overall social vulnerability index at the tract level, and then here are those 4 themes I was talking about, right? So socioeconomic themes, household composition disability theme, minority language theme, and then housing transportation theme. So these 4 here go into making up the overall SVI or social vulnerability index. So I'm going to remove these as well because I just want the overall score, which is that 0 to 1 that we are looking at we're looking at in the Not Even Pass project. Okay, so here's my 2 layers, right? And if you never use the new map layer, I think it's pretty handy. You kind of have this menu over here on the left. So this is our layers, or AKA table of contents. You can drag things, up and down. You can click on it if you want to show the table, the attribute table, properties. You want to remove it. You can do groups, all that fun stuff. You can look at your tables. Again, here's your base maps. You can make charts, which is actually still in beta, but it's actually a nice feature. Your legends, bookmarks, and we'll jump into the kind of saving and creating a web app here in a little bit. But one of the new features that I really like is some of the blending options that you can do with this. So you can already see, and this is Richmond, and we use Richmond since this is kind of where the University of Richmond is. And we can see some patterns. We can see that this blue area here is the most social vulnerable group. And so we can see that somewhat falls along the lines of a lot of our redlined areas. Not always, but for the most part, right, our C and D neighborhoods are our highest social vulnerability kind of communities. But it's hard to really tell exactly where those overlay, right? So think about kind of traditional workflows. All right, well, I'll have to put this into Pro. I'm going to have to, or QGIS, I'm going to have to clip the social vulnerability index polygons to my redline neighborhoods and do all that, right? That's a whole thing, right? Maybe I just visually want to see what this looks like. Well, the blending tools can really help you out in that regard. So in the properties of our homeowners loan corporation data, so I'm clicking on that, we can see that it's highlighted here. I'm going to go down to appearance and blending. And then I'm going to go clear down here to the bottom and I'm going to click destination in, right? And what this does is this visually clips the social vulnerability index data, polygons, tracks to my redline data, right? So I can see my neighborhoods now and what the vulnerability index is for those areas, right? Now I lost my redlining labeling, but what's nice is that if I click on this, right, I can see, okay, this is a very high vulnerability community, and then this is my D neighborhood, right? And so what's nice is that the pop-ups kind of do that work of showing, you know, where this lands. So here, right, this smaller piece, this lower piece, is pretty low vulnerability, right? But you can see it's still in that D redline neighborhood of the past. Of course, you can, you know, play with your transparency, but now you're saying, well, Justin, you lost your base map, right? You know, that's not really useful. You know, if you're not really from Richmond or you're trying to figure out where some of these neighborhoods are, that's not very helpful, right? Well, my base map is on, but the problem is with the blending mode, it's kind of dumping all of that stuff, right, into my redline neighborhoods, which is actually, this is kind of cool, right? It's like clipping my base map. But the problem is I want to see my base map. So I'm going to go back to the Living Atlas, and I'm going to grab the, I'm going to use this world light gray base map. So I'm going to add in another base map on top of this, right? And then I'm going to go to my blending mode again, and I'm going to go to destination. Let's see, I'm going to move this down. There we go. And go to destination. Let's not look at the top in. All right, 1 second. Uh-oh, I think I messed something up. Let's see. Let's see, something got crazy on me. Oh, okay. I think I turned it off. There we go. That's what it was. All right. So destination, the top. There we go. That's what I was looking for. Right. So now I see I have my homeowners loan corporation data, and I can drop the transparency on this a little bit. But now I actually have my base map, right? So I can see where these lie within, you know, a current base map or whatever base map you want to use. So it's somewhat of a kind of a hacky way to do it, but you know, I just did a lot of geoprocessing tools that I'd have to do on the kind of desktop side really quick to visually look at this, right? All right, so now we have this, right? We have these nice pop-ups. We can also create charts in here as well. So I'm not going to go through that today, but you can configure charts. So if I want to look at, you know, kind of like in our application, look at the total area of, you know, a grade, you can do that as well. Again, the charts are still in beta, so there's not a ton of functionality there. One thing I wanted to show you is the new addition of what's called a sketch layer. So if you go down here to the sketch layer, this allows you to, if anybody's ever worked with story maps and used express maps, it allows you to kind of annotate your web maps, yeah, with like, you know, overlays and annotation text and things like that that kind of stick to your map, which is a fantastic addition in my opinion. So say, you know, I'm creating this web map and I really want to talk about you know, the Churchill neighborhood in Richmond, right? So we see this was redlined. Now it's very low vulnerability, and this is a very highly gentrified area in Richmond, right? So I want to add a pin to that, right? Without actually, all right, having to create a feature class or a feature layer and add an attribute to that, right? I can just go drop a pin in there. I can create a pop-up for it. And I can say, whoops, I don't want to add that. I can say here, I want to say this is previously redlined neighborhood of Churchill, right? I can add in all sorts of other things, images if I want into that. And then now right, when I close out of this, right, I get this pop up here, right? So I can instantly kind of create data that helps my web map out right on the fly using these. And you can change the scale of these and all sorts of things, right? But it's a really nice addition, that sketch layer to your maps. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and save this. We like this web map. And just to reiterate, right, if I jump over here to Boston again, right, we can see that it's done the same thing, right? This is doing this to all my data, right? So say I like this map, right? I want to create a web map out of that. So I'm going to save it. If anybody's worked with ArcGIS Online before, it's, you know, ask you for this. So I'm going to say,
yeah, just really quick, Justin, before people save, I encourage you to use the search in the map and try to jump to your community or your area. Justin, if you can really quick just show where the search is in the new map.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you manually zoomed over to Boston.
I did. So you can add the search.
It's on the right-hand side towards the middle.
Right-hand side in the middle. Oh, sorry. Yes. Duh, I'm blind. Yeah.
Yeah, that's, that's partly why I wanted you to point it out, because I always have a hard time finding that new search. So yeah, you can grab that search and type in your town or your community, and then when you click save, then that way you have this as a map that you can go back to later on.
Exactly. Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, and I stumbled in there for the search. I haven't used that yet, so thank you for bringing that up.
Sure.
Perfect. So yeah, so we have our map here that we like, and we saved this. So I'm going to call this Redlining workshop. Again, you need to add some tags, and you can add a summary if you want, right? See how many times I can say redlining workshop. All right, and save map. So by saving the map, what this allows you to do is create a web app out of this, right? So maybe this is all you want, and you want to add this to a story map, or you want to share this to, you want to share this map to others. You can, change the share settings and all that if you wish, or you can kind of go a step further and create an app. Right, we can either add this to a story map directly and start one from scratch using this app. We can add it to a dashboard. I'm going to go to the instant apps, which have kind of changed just a little bit here, if anybody's worked with these. And you can see it's got a kind of a list here of ones that are available to you. We're going to do the zone lookup really quick. So again, right, if you haven't worked too much with web maps in ArcGIS Online, so there's web maps and web apps. So I like to think of web apps as like a skin or a covering on a web map. So it just kind of overlays on a web map and gives you extra functionality on top of that, right? If you need to edit the web, if you need to add the data and what the map looks like, you need to go back to your web map, and then that automatically gets transferred to the app. So when I teach students this is a little strange to them sometimes, the disconnection or how this kind of works in tandem with the web map. So just kind of keep that in mind. I'm not going to add a ton of stuff to this because we're closing in on time here. But what I do want to go show you is, it's really easy to configure these web apps once you have the data. I'm just going to select the 2 layers here that I want to use. I'm going to publish this. It has absolutely no style, so don't judge. So we're going to confirm, and we're going to launch this. So now here's my web app, right? And we created all this from the Living Atlas. We have not uploaded or touched a shapefile or a geodatabase since then, right? So what's nice about this one is if I click on this, right, what happens is it gets rid of all of this and then gives me kind of the pop-ups for that area. So this is I think a pretty neat tool for this. So it can just show me that neighborhood. It gives me the statistics right here, right? So I think this is a little far more useful, right? Since we're kind of since we're missing out on the styling of the red line maps, right? Especially in a city like Boston, right? So if we click on that, what's nice is that, okay, we see that this is a sliver, right? And that falls in a D neighborhood. All right. So hopefully that wasn't too much of a whirlwind of a demo there. But yeah, if you haven't used the map viewer, it's pretty cool. I'm thoroughly impressed. The blending tools are, I don't know if you've seen some of the uses of those, but especially with some topographic or hill shade stuff, you can do some really nice styling. You can do some bivariate symbology styling in there as well. So they've really upped their game, I think, in creating some good web maps.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. I'm just getting started with the new map viewer.
Me too.
But I had never seen the blending before, so thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, I was a little skeptical, when things are in beta. So I like to attribute things that come from Esri that are in beta to a college student dating. You never know how long they'll be around, so don't bring them home, to Thanksgiving, dinner. But it's out of beta now, so I've jumped on board.
Sounds good. All right, folks. Feel free. Does anybody have any questions? I saw we had one that came into the chat that said, "Are there any educational materials that we can use in GIS instruction?"
Oh, fantastic. Yes, there is. So my colleague, Annie Evans, who is our educational outreach, sorry, I do not know her exact title. I'm probably butchering her title. She is fantastic. She works with K through 12 teachers as well as college. And this is actually, she works for this project called New American History, which is affiliated with us. I popped that in the chat. They have full education materials for the redlining stuff. And she is connected to the Esri's kind of Geo Alliance for educators and all that stuff. So I just sent the link to New American History, which all of this stuff is in there for educators, as well as her contact information. But feel free to reach out to me if you need to connect with her, or I'm happy to help.
Great. We also have a question here that says that Rhode Island is listed as having redlining data available, but in the Atlas data, it's not showing Rhode Island data. Is there another layer that I should be looking for?
Oh, Rhode Island. I can't remember. I feel like Rhode Island was, so we have Woonsocket, I think. Is that what you're talking about? Woonsocket? So there's no area description data, I don't think, for Woonsocket. I'm trying to think what the other Rhode Island maps are.
That was from Christina. Christina, if you want to unmute yourself and elaborate. Oh, yeah, she said.
Yeah, it was Woonsocket, Providence, Central Falls, Pawtucket. There was 3 areas. Central Falls and Pawtucket were kind of grouped together. I noticed that was available when you were listing all of the states, municipalities in your redlining data. But then when we added it through the Atlas, I noticed that there wasn't anything showing up for that. I just wasn't sure if I was looking at the right data or if it was something else I needed to look for.
Oh, no, that should not be the case. So something must have went wrong there. So I'll take a look at that, because we have the polygons for. Ooh. So okay, yeah. So here's the issue. So the Rhode Island data doesn't have area descriptions, and so the layer we provided for Esri actually has the array of area description data in there. So I need to update that. That's why it's not showing up. But thank you. I'll work on getting that updated in the Living Atlas.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
All right, we have a couple more questions here. One says, I live in an area that's not included in the HOLC data set, but had a similar urban renewal efforts in the 1940s. This has been super helpful. Well, so not a question, but a statement.
So something to that. So the Homeowners Loan Corporation created, there were some more local efforts using the Homeowners Loan Corporation methods in smaller cities. And so part of the grant we just got was to go in the National Archive and pull some of those out. So I think our plan is to add about 40 or 50 smaller cities. They're not going to obviously have the very visual maps that are available, but some of that same data will be there. So we're going to be working on that in the coming year or two.
Great, and Neil posted another comment sort of related to that, just thoughts or knowledge about neighborhoods in redline cities that were not mapped by HOLC.
Yeah, so I forget, I'm blanking now who did a report. Somebody did a white paper on looking at, it might have been the Fed, might have been part of the Feds, but to look at neighborhoods that were redlined and neighborhoods that weren't redlined and had these security maps, and how they look today. And they found that there was a significant disadvantage to neighborhoods who had been, or cities that had redlining maps than today. If you want to reach out, I can pull up that paper for you as well. But yeah, there's been some research on that, looking at cities that haven't and had, and how they've kind of fared in long term.
Yeah, and along those lines, I just want to jump in quickly to talk about our NEARC community event call to action document. So hopefully you can all see my screen here. For those of you that have attended our social events in the past, or our workshops in the past, we have this call to action spreadsheet. And let me put that in the chat for you. And what this document is it's an opportunity for us to share some of our project ideas, or just to ask questions or pose ideas. And then the idea moving forward is that we'll spend more time down the line looking a little bit deeper into some of these ideas. So for this event, we have posed the question to say, how can you use redlining data to better understand the past and present conditions in your community? So I encourage you all, please, to pose some sort of topics or ideas into this document. I guess I'm giving you a little bit of homework here. So you can see there's two examples there from myself and Adam. One example being overlaying the redlining data with parks and open space or street tree data that I know that we have in Cambridge, to see if there was any trends in where those were located. Another idea is thinking about the state and federal highway system, and were there any highways that were built through redlining neighborhoods, possibly destroying these neighborhoods? So I encourage you, please put some ideas in here. We put a few more columns just for more contextual information, so you can put your community, or as Adam indicated, he said that really this could be for any community that has highways located through it or in it. And then just try to think about what data that you could potentially use, or what data layers you might need. And if those layers don't exist in your community, then as Justin showed us today, you can always go to the Living Atlas and see what might exist there. I know that the highway information, for example, would be in the Living Atlas. And then you can also feel free to put in your name, and if you would be willing to share or discuss more about this particular project. So as I mentioned, we've been doing this for all of our workshops. So there's tabs along the bottom of the page, and you can actually jump back to previous workshops. So you can see we have our census data topics. And for that event, we were talking about what questions you're trying to use with the American Community Survey and the census data. So you can feel free to post more questions here as well. And then our event that we had back in February, where we were talking about what topics around geography and and we were talking about topics around geography and its relation to segregation or other social justice themes that we were curious about, and trying to tie those back to our communities as well. So I encourage you to please take a look at this document, and feel free to add to today's event, of course, but also going back to previous events if you're interested. And down the line, we will be coming back to this in another community event so that we can dive deeper into these topics. So just a couple more things before I let you all loose. Just want to mention that we do have our spring conference is coming up on May 18th, and we have the schedule and information is posted on our NEARC website. So I highly encourage you to take a peek at the schedule. We just this morning updated our keynote details, so we're very excited to have our keynote speaker. Our keynote speaker is set for that conference, as well as all of the other sessions. So I highly encourage you to take a look at the schedule and register to join. Our registration is open. We are after the April 20th date, so the registration fee is $50. But if you have any concerns about that at all, then I highly encourage you to submit a scholarship. There's scholarship information available on our website, and I know that we do still have scholarships available. So If you want to attend, which I highly recommend that you do, then please don't let that $50 be what holds you back. And we do have 2 different social events that will be put together as part of that event on May 18th. So as part of the conference, we have a GeoJeopardy social, which for folks that attended the fall conference, we played a little GeoJeopardy, which is basically just a GIS and NEARC themed Jeopardy game, which was a lot of fun in the fall. And so our host committee is putting together brand new themes and questions for you for this year. So really excited for that. And then following the conference, we will have a NEARC Spring Social Mappy Hour. And that event is technically separate from the conference, so you don't have to attend the conference in order to attend our Spring Social. The registration information is available on our website. If you go to the community section, then you'll see it's listed under the upcoming events. And also on our community website, you can always access past events. So if you want to access this recording later on, then you can find that and other recordings from our past events on our NEARC website. So with that, I do see that there's a few other questions that came in. I will save the chat and we'll follow up with folks after with some of the resources that Justin shared with us today. But again, Justin, thank you so much. This was a really fantastic presentation, and thank you all so much for coming. We look forward to seeing you on May 18th.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.